The desert sun blazed mercilessly over Fallujah as Marine Corps Sergeant Maria Rodriguez adjusted her helmet strap one more time. The November heat seemed to mock the approaching winter, and dust particles danced in the air like tiny ghosts. She had been deployed to Iraq for 8 months now, serving as a combat medic with the 2nd Battalion. At 24 years old, Maria had already saved more lives than she could count. But nothing could have prepared her for what was about to unfold in the narrow streets of this war-torn city. The mission briefing that morning had been routine. Intelligence suggested that a high-value target was hiding in a compound on the eastern edge of the city. Maria's unit was tasked with providing medical support during what was expected to be a straightforward extraction. She checked her medical kit methodically, running through her mental checklist of supplies: morphine, bandages, hemostatic agents, IV fluids. Everything was in place. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, a dance she had performed countless times before. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, a veteran of 3 deployments, led the briefing with his usual calm demeanor. The operation would involve 2 squads moving through a residential area that had been relatively quiet for weeks. Local informants had provided detailed maps of the compound, and aerial surveillance showed minimal activity. Everything pointed to a clean operation. Maria listened intently, mentally mapping out potential casualty collection points and evacuation routes. Her training had taught her to always think 3 steps ahead. As the convoy rolled through the city gates, Maria observed the familiar sights of a community caught between normalcy and chaos. Children played in dusty courtyards, while their mothers hung laundry on rooftops. Elderly men sat in small groups, their eyes following the American vehicles with expressions that ranged from curious to cautious. The city had been relatively peaceful lately, with reconstruction efforts slowly gaining momentum. Local shops were reopening, and there were signs that life was gradually returning to normal. The convoy consisted of 4 armored vehicles, each carrying a specialized team. Maria rode in the 2nd vehicle with her medical supplies and 2 other medics. Private Jackson, barely 19 and on his first deployment, sat across from her, nervously fidgeting with his equipment. Maria had taken him under her wing, teaching him the harsh realities of battlefield medicine. Next to him sat Corporal Williams, a seasoned medic who had served in Afghanistan before arriving in Iraq. The 3 of them formed a tight-knit team that had earned the respect of every Marine in the battalion. The radio crackled with routine communications as they navigated through narrow streets lined with concrete barriers and concertina wire. Children waved from doorways, and some vendors even smiled as the convoy passed. The atmosphere felt almost normal, which should have been the first warning sign. In Iraq, normal was often the calm before the storm. Maria had learned to trust her instincts, and something deep in her gut whispered that today would be different. They turned into a narrow alley that led to the target compound. The buildings on either side rose 3 and 4 stories high, creating a canyon effect that limited visibility and escape routes. Maria noticed that the usual street activity had disappeared. No children played in the alleys, no women carried water jugs, and no merchants hawked their wares. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rumble of diesel engines and the creak of armor plating. The lead vehicle stopped 50 meters from the compound entrance. Through her bulletproof window, Maria could see the target building, a nondescript concrete structure with barred windows and a heavy wooden door. Intelligence photos had shown it clearly, but seeing it in person gave her an uneasy feeling. The building seemed too quiet, too perfect. Years of combat experience had taught her team to recognize when something felt wrong, and every instinct screamed danger. Suddenly, the world exploded into chaos. The first rocket-propelled grenade struck the lead vehicle with devastating force, sending it spinning sideways and blocking the narrow alley. The explosion was followed immediately by a hailstorm of automatic weapons fire from multiple directions. Windows that had appeared empty moments before erupted with muzzle flashes. The ambush was perfectly coordinated, with shooters positioned in buildings on both sides of the alley and across rooftops. Maria's vehicle lurched violently as bullets struck the armor plating. The distinctive crack of AK-47 rounds mixed with the heavier thump of machine gun fire. Through the chaos, She could hear the screams of wounded Marines and the urgent voices of her teammates calling for medical assistance. Her training kicked in immediately, overriding the natural fear response. She grabbed her medical kit and began assessing the situation, looking for ways to reach the wounded while staying alive. The driver of her vehicle, Sergeant Martinez, fought to maneuver in the tight space while enemy fire intensified. Bullets shattered the bulletproof glass, sending spiderweb cracks across her field of vision. The vehicle behind them had also taken heavy fire, and she could see smoke beginning to pour from its engine compartment. Radio communications became a cacophony of urgent reports, casualty calls, and requests for immediate support. Private Jackson looked at her with wide eyes filled with terror and determination. Despite his fear, he was ready to follow her into the firefight. Corporal Williams was already preparing medical supplies, his movements calm and methodical despite the chaos around them. These two men would follow her anywhere, and she knew that lives depended on her decisions in the next few minutes. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. Through a gap in the shattered window, Maria could see Marines from the lead vehicle attempting to establish defensive positions behind concrete barriers. Several were clearly wounded, dragging themselves to cover while laying down suppressing fire. The enemy had chosen their ambush site perfectly. The narrow alley provided excellent fields of fire, while limiting the Americans' ability to maneuver or retreat. It was a killing ground designed to maximize casualties. The intensity of fire was unlike anything Maria had experienced in her previous deployments. This wasn't a random attack by insurgents. It was a carefully planned military operation, executed by experienced fighters. The coordination between different firing positions, the timing of the initial RPG strike, and the sustained volume of fire all indicated that this was the work of highly trained opposition forces. As bullets continued to impact their vehicle, Maria made a decision that would define the rest of her life. Despite the overwhelming enemy fire, despite the tactical disadvantage, and despite every survival instinct screaming at her to stay in cover, she knew she had to reach the wounded Marines in the lead vehicle. Her oath as a medic was clear. She would risk everything to save lives, regardless of the personal cost. She turned to her team with a look of fierce determination. Jackson and Williams saw something in her eyes that told them this moment would test everything they had trained for. The young private swallowed hard and nodded, while the experienced corporal simply checked his weapon and medical supplies one final time. They were about to step into hell, but they would do it together. The enemy fire showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, it seemed to be growing more intense, as additional shooters joined the attack. Maria realized that waiting for the situation to improve was not an option. The wounded Marines needed immediate medical attention, and every second of delay could mean the difference between life and death. She took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and prepared to open the vehicle door. The ambush in Fallujah was about to claim its most determined victim, but Maria Rodriguez was not planning to go down without a fight. The vehicle door opened with a metallic groan that seemed to invite death itself. Maria Rodriguez stepped into a storm of bullets that turned the air around her into a deadly whirlwind of metal and concrete fragments. The sound was deafening. The sharp crack of rifle rounds mixing with the deeper boom of explosions and the screams of wounded men. She moved with purpose, her medical training overriding every survival instinct as she sprinted toward the overturned lead vehicle where Marines lay trapped and bleeding. The first bullet found her within 3 steps. It struck her left shoulder with the force of a sledgehammer, spinning her partially around and sending fire down her entire arm. The impact nearly knocked her to the ground, but Maria had trained for this moment. She knew that stopping meant death, not just for her, but for the wounded Marines who depended on her medical expertise. Blood began to soak through her uniform, but her legs kept moving forward through the chaos. Corporal Williams and Private Jackson followed close behind her, laying down covering fire with their M4 rifles. They moved in a practiced formation that they had drilled hundreds of times, but nothing could have prepared them for the intensity of enemy fire that swept the narrow alley. Williams shouted something at her. but his words were lost in the cacophony of battle. His face showed the same determination that drove Maria forward. Even as bullets shattered concrete all around them, the second and third bullets struck her almost simultaneously as she dove for cover behind a destroyed concrete barrier. One round caught her in the right thigh, tearing through muscle and sending a shockwave of pain up her entire leg. The other bullet grazed her helmet, leaving a deep gouge in the Kevlar that would have killed her if it had struck 2 inches lower. She could feel warm blood running down her leg, but her hands remained steady as she reached for her medical kit. 20 meters ahead, she could see the lead vehicle on its side, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. 2 Marines lay motionless near the rear of the vehicle, while a third was attempting to drag himself to safety despite what appeared to be a serious leg wound. Staff Sergeant Chen, the squad leader, was positioned behind the vehicle's front wheel, returning fire while simultaneously trying to assess his wounded men. His face was covered in blood from what looked like shrapnel wounds, but his weapon remained steady. Maria knew she had to reach those wounded Marines, regardless of her own injuries. The 4th bullet struck her as she prepared to move again, this time catching her in the lower back, just below her body armor. The impact drove her face first into the rubble, and for a moment, the world went dark around the edges. Pain flooded her nervous system like molten metal. But her training had taught her to compartmentalize, to function despite trauma that would incapacitate most people. She pushed herself up with trembling arms and continued forward. Each movement sent waves of agony through her damaged body, but she had seen worse injuries and continued to fight. During her medical training, instructors had taught her that the human body could endure incredible trauma and still function if the mind remained focused. She held on to that knowledge like a lifeline as bullets continued to seek her out. Private Jackson appeared beside her, his young face streaked with dirt and determination. He had been hit in the arm but was still functional, still ready to follow her lead. Together, they moved toward the overturned vehicle in short rushes, using whatever cover they could find. The enemy fire seemed to be coming from everywhere. Windows, rooftops, doorways, and hidden positions that had been prepared well in advance of the ambush. The 5th bullet caught her in the left side, just below her ribcage. This one felt different, deeper, more serious. Maria could taste copper in her mouth, and knew that internal bleeding was now a factor. Her body was beginning to shut down non-essential functions to preserve vital organs, but her mind remained crystal clear. She had to reach the wounded Marines before her own injuries overwhelmed her ability to provide medical care. As she approached the overturned vehicle, she could see the extent of the casualties. Lance Corporal Morrison was unconscious with what appeared to be a head injury, blood pooling beneath his helmet. Sergeant Davis had taken shrapnel in his chest and was struggling to breathe, each inhale a visible effort that spoke of punctured lungs or worse. The 3rd Marine, Private Foster, had a massive leg wound that was bleeding heavily despite his attempts to apply a tourniquet with one hand. The 6th and 7th bullets found her as she reached the vehicle. One struck her right arm, numbing her hand and making it difficult to manipulate her medical equipment. The other bullet caught her in the lower abdomen, a wound that sent fire through her entire core. She could feel her strength beginning to ebb, but there was no time for self-assessment. Marines were dying, and she was their only hope for survival. Working with movements that had been drilled into her through countless training exercises, Maria began triaging the wounded. Morrison needed immediate evacuation for his head injury, but she could stabilize him temporarily. Davis required chest decompression to address what she suspected was a tension pneumothorax. Foster's leg wound was severe, but manageable if she could control the bleeding and establish an IV for fluid replacement. The 8th bullet struck her in the back as she worked on Morrison's head wound. This one felt like it might have hit something vital, possibly a kidney. Blood began to soak through her uniform more rapidly, and she could feel her coordination beginning to deteriorate. Her hands, normally steady as a surgeon's, began to tremble slightly as she applied pressure dressings and prepared medications. Corporal Williams reached her position just as she began working on Davis's chest wound. He had been hit twice himself but was still functional. still able to provide assistance. Together, they worked with an efficiency born of training and desperation. Williams prepared IV equipment, while Maria performed a needle decompression that likely saved Davis's life. The procedure required steady hands and precise anatomical knowledge, both of which she managed to maintain despite her deteriorating condition. The 9th bullet found her as she moved to treat Foster's leg wound. This round struck her in the left leg, shattering bone and sending her sprawling across the rubble-strewn ground. For the first time since the ambush began, Maria felt truly vulnerable. Her left leg would no longer support her weight, and blood loss was beginning to affect her cognitive function. The edges of her vision began to darken, but she forced herself to continue working. She dragged herself to Foster's position and began applying a proper tourniquet to his damaged leg. The young Marine was conscious, but in shock, his face pale and covered with cold sweat. She talked to him calmly as she worked, her voice steady despite her own critical condition. Years of training had taught her that maintaining patient confidence was as important as the medical procedures themselves. The 10th bullet struck her in the shoulder as she prepared Foster's IV line. Her dominant hand was now compromised, forcing her to work with her offhand while fighting waves of nausea and dizziness. The enemy fire had not diminished during the time she had been working on casualties. If anything, it seemed to have intensified as more fighters joined the battle. She realized that her chances of survival were diminishing rapidly, but the wounded Marines still needed her expertise. Private Jackson, despite his own wounds, had maintained a defensive perimeter around her position. His young face showed a maturity that comes only from combat, and his weapon remained steady as he engaged targets in the surrounding buildings. Williams continued to assist with medical procedures while simultaneously coordinating with other surviving Marines to establish better defensive positions. The 11th bullet was the one that finally brought her down. It struck her in the chest, just below her body armor, and she knew immediately that this wound was potentially fatal. The impact knocked her backward, and she could feel blood beginning to fill her lungs. Each breath became a conscious effort, and the darkness around her vision began to close in more rapidly. But even as her body began to shut down, Maria's mind remained focused on her patients. She had successfully stabilized all 3 wounded Marines, giving them a fighting chance for survival if evacuation could be arranged. Morrison's head injury was manageable with the medications she had administered. Davis was breathing easier after the chest decompression. Foster's leg wound was controlled, and his IV was running properly. As she lay among the rubble with 11 bullet wounds in her body, Maria Rodriguez felt a sense of completion rather than defeat. She had done her job, fulfilled her oath as a medic, and given everything she had to save the lives of her fellow Marines. The sounds of battle continued around her, but they seemed to be growing more distant. Her body was failing, but her spirit remained strong. Williams knelt beside her, applying pressure dressings to her wounds, while tears streamed down his dirt-covered face. Jackson maintained his defensive position, but kept glancing back at her with an expression of disbelief and admiration. These 2 men had witnessed something extraordinary. A human being pushing beyond every physical limitation to serve others, even unto death. The last thing Maria remembered was the sound of incoming helicopters and the urgent voices of her teammates calling for immediate medical evacuation. She had done everything possible to save her patients, and now it was time to let others take care of her. As consciousness slipped away, she felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that her sacrifice had meaning. 48 hours after the ambush in Fallujah, Navy SEAL Team 6 moved through the rubble-strewn alley like ghosts in the pre-dawn darkness. Their mission was classified as a body recovery operation, though none of them expected to find survivors after 2 days in the harsh Iraqi desert. The temperature had dropped to near freezing during the night, and the area had been abandoned by American forces due to continued enemy activity. Intelligence suggested that insurgents had booby-trapped the site, making any rescue attempt extremely dangerous. Lieutenant Commander Jake Sullivan led the 4-man team with methodical precision. A veteran of multiple deployments and countless high-risk operations, he had seen enough battlefield carnage to know that hope was usually a luxury that combat zones could not afford. Behind him moved Chief Petty Officer Marcus Washington, a medical specialist whose skills had saved dozens of lives in similar situations. The team also included Petty Officer First Class David Kim, an explosives expert, and Petty Officer Second Class Anthony Martinez, a communications specialist. The SEALs had been operating in the area for 3 weeks as part of a broader counterinsurgency campaign. They knew the terrain intimately, having conducted numerous raids and reconnaissance missions in the neighborhood. Intelligence reports indicated that the ambush site had been abandoned immediately after the firefight, but recent drone surveillance showed signs of enemy activity in surrounding buildings. The mission would require them to move quickly and quietly to avoid detection. As they approached the location where Marine Sergeant Maria Rodriguez was last seen, the team moved with practiced silence. Their night vision equipment turned the darkness into a green-tinted landscape of destruction. Overturned vehicles, scattered equipment, and blast craters told the story of a fierce battle that had raged for hours before American forces were able to establish a corridor for evacuation. The enemy had fought with unusual determination and coordination. The first challenge was reaching the actual site where Rodriguez had fallen. Intelligence indicated that the area had been mined with improvised explosive devices during the 2-day interval since the ambush. Kim used specialized detection equipment to identify safe paths through the debris field, marking clear zones with infrared beacons that were visible only through their night vision goggles. Each step forward required careful consideration and absolute trust in his expertise. Chief Washington carried advanced medical equipment that could potentially sustain life even in cases of extreme trauma. His pack contained experimental medications, portable surgical instruments, and life support systems that were still being tested by military medical researchers. If they found Rodriguez alive, which seemed impossible given the circumstances, he was prepared to perform emergency surgery in the field under combat conditions. The overturned vehicles came into view as the team crested a small pile of rubble. The lead vehicle had been completely destroyed by the initial rocket attack, its armor plating twisted into unrecognizable shapes. The second vehicle showed extensive bullet damage and had obviously been abandoned under intense fire. Scattered around, the vehicles were pieces of equipment, empty ammunition cases, and bloodstains that told a story of desperate fighting. Sullivan called for a halt as they reached the perimeter of the main site. Through his night vision scope, he could see what appeared to be a body lying near the overturned lead vehicle. The figure was partially covered by debris and had not moved during the 10 minutes they had been observing the area. Standard procedure called for them to approach cautiously, watching for signs of booby traps or enemy ambushes that might be using the body as bait. Kim moved forward first, his detection equipment sweeping for explosive devices. The enemy had developed sophisticated techniques for turning casualty sites into death traps, and the SEALs had encountered such tactics on previous missions. His instruments detected several suspicious areas that required careful investigation before the team could proceed. Working methodically, he marked safe approaches and identified potential threats. As they moved closer to the body, Washington began to notice details that surprised him. The positioning was wrong for a corpse that had been lying in the desert for 2 days. The arms were positioned defensively rather than in the relaxed pose typical of death. Most significantly, he could see what appeared to be improvised medical dressings that had been applied and modified multiple times, suggesting continued consciousness and self-treatment. The discovery that changed everything came when Martinez detected a faint heat signature through his thermal imaging equipment. The reading was consistent with a living human being, though the temperature was dangerously low, and the pattern suggested someone in severe hypothermic shock. He signaled the team immediately, and their entire mission profile shifted from body recovery to emergency medical evacuation. Washington reached Rodriguez first, his medical training immediately assessing her condition. She was unconscious but definitely alive, her breathing shallow and irregular. Her body temperature was critically low, and she showed signs of severe dehydration and blood loss. Most remarkably, she had managed to treat her own wounds using medical supplies scavenged from the battlefield, applying tourniquets and pressure dressings with a level of skill that spoke to her medical training. The extent of her injuries was staggering. Washington counted 11 distinct bullet wounds, several of which should have been individually fatal. Her survival represented a combination of exceptional medical knowledge, incredible willpower, and what could only be described as miraculous circumstances. She had managed to find shelter in a partially collapsed concrete structure that provided protection from the elements while remaining hidden from enemy patrols. Evidence around her position told the story of her 2-day ordeal. She had crawled nearly 50 meters from where she had originally fallen, dragging herself to a position that offered better protection and access to scattered medical supplies. Empty water bottles and MRE packages indicated that she had managed to sustain herself with resources found among the abandoned equipment. Most impressively, she had continued to treat her wounds, replacing bandages and adjusting tourniquets as her condition changed. Washington began emergency treatment immediately, while the rest of the team established a defensive perimeter. Her condition was critical but stable, suggesting that her medical interventions had been successful in preventing immediate death from blood loss or shock. He started an IV line to address dehydration and administered medications to support her cardiovascular system. Her body had begun shutting down non-essential functions to preserve vital organs, but her core temperature and blood pressure indicated that recovery was possible. The most challenging aspect of her condition was hypothermia. 2 nights in the desert had lowered her body temperature to dangerous levels, and rewarming had to be accomplished gradually to avoid cardiac complications. Washington used specialized heating pads and warm saline solutions to begin the process, while monitoring her vital signs continuously. Her pulse was weak but steady, and her breathing began to improve as her circulation stabilized. Sullivan coordinated the evacuation while his teammates worked on Rodriguez. The nearest safe landing zone for a medical helicopter was 3 kilometers away through hostile territory. They would need to carry her on a stretcher while maintaining operational security in an area known to be patrolled by enemy forces. The mission had become exponentially more complex, but no SEAL would consider leaving a fellow service member behind. As they prepared for movement, Rodriguez briefly regained consciousness. Her eyes opened slowly, focusing on Washington's face with confusion and recognition. She tried to speak but could only manage a whisper that was barely audible even in the desert silence. Washington leaned close to hear her words, and what she said would stay with him for the rest of his career. Did they make it? The Marines in the vehicle? Even after 2 days of suffering, fighting for her own survival against impossible odds, her first concern was for the men she had risked everything to save. Washington assured her that all 3 Marines had survived and been evacuated successfully. The relief on her face was visible even through her physical distress, and she managed a slight smile before losing consciousness again. The journey to the evacuation point took 4 hours of careful movement through dangerous terrain. The SEALs took turns carrying the stretcher, while maintaining security and monitoring Rodriguez's condition. Her vital signs remained stable throughout the movement, suggesting that Washington's field treatment had been successful in stabilizing her condition. The combination of advanced medical care and her own extraordinary resilience was keeping her alive. The medical helicopter that finally lifted Rodriguez from the Iraqi desert carried more than just a wounded Marine. It carried the embodiment of everything that military medical personnel represent: selfless dedication to saving others, regardless of personal cost. The crew chief, who helped load her stretcher into the aircraft, later said that he had never seen anyone survive injuries of that magnitude, much less maintain the will to continue treating themselves for 2 days in a combat zone. Rodriguez's evacuation marked the beginning of a long recovery process that would take her through military hospitals in Germany and finally to Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington. Her survival became legendary within military medical circles, studied by researchers trying to understand the limits of human endurance and the effectiveness of self-administered trauma care. But for the Marines whose lives she had saved, she was simply the medic who had kept her promise to bring them home alive. The SEALs who found her that night never forgot the image of a warrior who had refused to surrender even when death seemed certain. Her story became part of their unit's oral tradition, told to new team members as an example of what courage and determination could accomplish, even in the face of impossible odds. In a profession where heroes are common, Maria Rodriguez had achieved something truly extraordinary. She had proven that the human spirit could overcome any physical limitation when motivated by love for fellow warriors.